Do you understand the approach? I repeat, do you understand the approach? We are proceeding with the approach at 3,500 feet. Have you reached the outer marker? I repeat, have you reached the outer marker? Outer marker will report.
On the evening of December 17, 1997, Aerosvit Flight 241 was a routine international flight scheduled to travel from Odessa, Ukraine to Thessaloniki, Greece. But what should have been a standard journey turned into a tragedy, claiming the lives of 70 people, including 62 passengers and 8 crew members. The aircraft, a Yakolev Yak-42, crashed into a mountainside during a missed approach into Thessaloniki. The story of Flight 241 is not only one of loss, but also a profound tale of aviation safety, filled with miscommunications, mistakes and misjudgments that ultimately led to a failure of decision-making both by the crew and the airline's operations. Aerosvit Flight 241 was a scheduled international flight connecting Odessa, a bustling port city along Ukraine's Black Sea coast, with Thessaloniki, the cultural and economic heart of Greece-Macedonia region. The flight was initially planned to be operated by a Boeing 737, a dependable workhorse for commercial aviation. But when an engine issue grounded the Boeing 737, it was replaced with the Yakolev Yak-42, a Soviet-era aircraft that was functional but had a much different handling and operational system than the Boeing. Though the change in aircraft might have seemed like a minor inconvenience at the time, it was the first of many missteps that would lead to disaster. While the crew may not have been aware of it, the aircraft swap was a significant turning point that would ultimately play a part in the tragic outcome of the flight. As the aircraft departed Odessa, everything appeared to be in order. Passengers boarded the plane and the crew began their journey toward Thessaloniki. At first glance, this flight was like so many others, just another day in the air for the airline and its passengers. The flight entered Greek airspace on schedule at 8:39 p.m. local time, and the crew made initial contact with the Macedonia approach at Thessaloniki airport. The first signs of confusion began almost immediately after entering Greek airspace. The crew was instructed by air traffic control to descend for VOR DME ILS approach to runway 16 at Thessaloniki. However, a critical miscommunication occurred when the crew misinterpreted the air traffic control message meant for another aircraft routine instruction that was mistakenly read by the crew of Flight 241. They thought it applied to them, which led to an initial delay in clearance process. Once the misunderstanding was cleared up, the flight was cleared to descend. But things went wrong once again. The crew arrived at Thessaloniki airport at an unusually high altitude, flying over the airport without descending as expected. The controller quickly noticed the mistake and instructed the crew to climb to 6,000 feet, putting them into a southbound holding pattern to correct the approach. At this point, the crew should have been preparing to adjust their route to reorient themselves for a second approach. However, the flight crew seemed unaware of the gravity of the mistake. They responded passively, acknowledging the controller's instruction but failing to adjust their actions accordingly. Instead of regaining control over the aircraft's flypath, the crew simply floated aimlessly, heading south rather than making the necessary adjustments to bring the plane back toward the airport. The confusion in the cockpit deepened as the flight crew continued their course without direction. Although they were repeatedly told to hold the pattern and follow specific routes, the crew seemed unsure of the exact procedure and failed to follow the instructions to the letter. After several minutes, the crew was cleared for a second attempt to land. During this phase of the flight, the crew communicated that they were on a correct course, reassuring the air traffic controller. However, the information provided by the crew was contradicted by the aircraft's actual position. At this point, the controller, suspecting that the crew might be misaligned with the approach, asked for further clarification. But the crew, even though disoriented, remained confident. The crew was instructed to follow the correct approach procedure again, but the responses were vague. They had been informed about the VOR-DME ILS approach, but the lack of comprehension became evident when they requested radar vectoring assistance service that Thessaloniki airport was not equipped to provide. The controller asked them repeatedly if they understood the approach procedure. When the crew responded ambiguously, expressing uncertainty about the localizer, the controller sought reassurance. "Do you understand the approach?" The crew's response seemed to alleviate the controllers' worries temporarily, as they claimed they were proceeding with the approach at 3,500 feet. Despite the crew's uncertainty, the controller proceeded to guide them with the last set of instructions, asking the crew to report once they were established on the ILS localizer. As the aircraft continued its descent, the controller's confidence in the crew began to dwindle. It was clear that the communication between the cockpit and the air traffic control was slipping further, as the crew did not understand or follow the necessary steps. At 9:11 p.m. local time, the final communication from Flight 241 came through. The controller asked the crew whether they had reached the outer marker, a critical point on the approach. The crew responded briefly, "Outer marker will report," and then only silence. That was the last transmission received from Flight 241. The aircraft's radar contact was lost and all further communication ceased. The plane was declared missing. A search and rescue operation was immediately launched, and it wasn't long before the wreckage of the aircraft was located at the base of a mountainside with no survivors. The crew's failure to act quickly and decisively had led to the aircraft flying off course during the critical moments of the approach. A failure to declare an emergency and ask for assistance in a timely manner sealed the flight's tragic fate. The investigation that followed the crash was exhaustive. The Greek Aircraft Accident Inquiry Council, working closely with Ukrainian and Russian investigators, published the final report nearly a year later, on November 11, 1998. The crash had been caused by a series of failures that ultimately resulted in the death of all aboard. The primary causes of the crash, as laid out in the final report, included failure to plan and execute the approach. The flight crew did not adequately plan or execute the approach or missed approach procedure for runway 16 at Thessaloniki, Macedonia airport. Despite the controllers' repeated efforts to guide the crew, they were unable to follow the basic steps to complete the approach safely. Failure to properly utilize equipment. The crew failed to utilize the available radio navigational aids and aircraft instruments properly. The crew failed to interpret or apply the information presented to them. Failure to declare an emergency. The crew failed to recognize the gravity of the situation when they lost their orientation. Despite numerous cues signaling that they were off course, the crew chose not to declare an emergency. This left them without the necessary assistance from the air traffic control, which could have been pivotal in averting the crash. Failure to act on GPWS warning. The captain failed to take decisive action when the ground proximity warning system alarm sounded just 30 seconds before impact. The failure to initiate a maximum climb in response to the alarm meant that the aircraft collided with the mountainside. Lack of command presence and cockpit discipline. The flight crew displayed a lack of command presence, discipline and teamwork in the cockpit. The confusion and disorganization between the captain, co-pilot and instructor pilot led to ineffective communication and decision-making. Inadequate oversight by the airline. The airline's poor oversight allowed for the scheduling of an inadequately prepared crew and aircraft that was not in full compliance with international safety regulations. The Yak-42 had inoperative VHF and AV receiver and had not been issued the necessary type certificate for international flights, putting passengers and crew at risk. Following the publication of the report, both Ukrainian and Greek authorities took swift action to address the deficiencies revealed by the investigation. The Ukrainian State Department of Aviation Transport was urged to implement compulsory cockpit resource management training for all flight crews. This training would focus on improving communication, decision-making and teamwork in the cockpit, helping future crews avoid the mistakes made by the Flight 241 crew. Meanwhile, the Hellenic Civil Aviation Authority was urged to install radar facilities at Thessaloniki's airport, something that had been lacking and contributed to the difficulties in tracking and assisting the aircraft during the emergency. The loss of Flight 241 is a painful chapter in aviation history, but the lessons learned from the tragedy have had a lasting impact. Changes in cockpit training, improved communication standards and the installation of radar facilities have contributed to greater safety in aviation today.